the psychedelic experience, and we've talked about things like ego dissolution and things like that. It accelerated my eventual
Hmm.
collapse, basically. However, the insights that came from that were also very true and
Hmm.
positive. And in the end, what it taught me was you need to wrap yourself around community. You need to take time to integrate the experiences that you have. And if used in the right way, it can be an incredibly healing, divine experience that for me has actually eliminated those temper tantrums, has eliminated that lack of impulse control, all these things that healed over time, but needed some pretty heavy lessons and blows along the way.
That's why I fuck with you. That's why I fuck with you.
Welcome to Psychedelic Diaries. I am Rick Christian, and we have a delightful show for you today. We will be discussing psychedelics and AI, messages from future you, and of course, experiences on high doses of psychedelics. Tyler Bryden, CEO of Speak.ai, will be here momentarily for a deep dive and a soul search. But first, as usual, let's kick things off with a nugget and a noodle. And as for today's nugget, Field Trip Health splits into two. And this piece of news really bummed me out because I've been high on them. But Field Trip paves the way for this industry in many ways and deserves a lot of credit. And as for the noodle, something I've been noodling on of late, manipulating time. Now, deep work with high doses of psychedelics can often turn one into an armchair philosopher or physicist. Speaking of which, Einstein seemed to believe time is an illusion and there are simply an infinite number of nows. After one friend's death, he is quoted as saying, "People like us know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." And I started playing with this idea after a high dose trip. If time is infinite and nonlinear, perhaps there's a way to manipulate that. And here's how I did it: make a habit of sending yourself love into the past. And if you do it enough, sooner or later, you live in a world where future you is constantly sending you love. Can we exploit the illusion of time by sharing love, energy, information between these infinite nows? Something to noodle on. Our next guest is the CEO and founder of Speak AI and an activist leader in the Canadian psychedelic scene, Tyler Bryden. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. You gave me a lot to think about right at the start there. So pleasure. I won't jump into that. I know we're on a time, even though time is infinite, as you said. We'll keep this blocked in as nice as we can.
Well, feel free to bring up some of that stuff if you want, but we do have some fun stuff to go over today. But really quick, Tyler, I got to ask: you're a hockey guy, and in Canada, obviously, that's a big thing. But you had some significant skills. Who do you like in the NHL playoffs this year?
Oh man, that's a question. So I grew up at this intersection. So Canadian, and you have two choices. You have Detroit Red Wings or Toronto Maple Leafs. My dad tried to pull me to the Leafs. I said no, I'm not going to go that way. I'm going to be a Red Wings fan, and I'm glad I did. I got to live through dynasties and have a team that I cheer for be successful almost every year. I don't even know where we're at in standings this year, but I'm always rooting for the Red Wings. Nowadays, I'll go back and resort to the Leafs because I'm a Canadian and I'm close to Toronto.
I love that. My father was a Red Wings fan too. So, okay, that's a fun start. Let's dive into the meat of this, Tyler. You are one of my favorites because of our Venn diagram overlap, if you will, in AI and psychedelics. How might those two industries or tools converge in the near future?
Yeah. It's I mean it's a really interesting space, one I've had the privilege and I think the challenge of delving
Hmm.
into, and I know you do as well too. So there's a nice shared sort of understanding and perspective here. I think there's two sides to what I see, which are there's theoretical applications, which are still quite novel and a lot of work to do, and then there's much more practical applications that are using the technology today in like a more concrete way. So I'll touch on the concrete way example first. There's a company, an amazing company called DeepScribe, and what DeepScribe does monitors patient sessions, automatically turns it into this idea of a SOAP assessment, so subjective objective assessment plan. Basically, turns it into doctor's notes and streamlines that entire process. And the technology today is available to do that. You can look at certain keywords, phrases, build out that assessment or that doctor's note, and then really increase the efficiency in that process. So I think that's a very concrete method that's actually being used today. More on the abstract side, I think what people are doing or more novel is like, how can we diagnose or assess people based off what they're saying, voice, progression through treatment. And there's some really exciting progress. And there's an amazing company called Kintsugi. Kintsugi is like the practice of rebuilding pottery to make it better than it was before with gold. An amazing company. And they've sort of built in 30 seconds, you can record your voice and at a high level of accuracy detect depression, anxiety, and things like that. So those novel applications are there, but as you've, I think, explored in your own journey, there's so many nuances between patients, communication, human language, what substances are being used, the daily lifestyle that put that area into some risk. And I think the final goal here is what people are trying to do is predict. They're trying to predict or intervene earlier instead of letting someone worsen. And that can be really exciting, but there's a challenge with that too. And you could say, just one last note on this, I think, is there's people who are trying to pop up notifications either to the care provider or the patient. But if you pop up a notification too early to either, it could change the course of healthcare. And that could be a good thing, or that could be possibly a negative thing. And if you get a notification that says, hey, it looks like you're trending down in depression and anxiety, does that help you adjust, or does that just send you further down that pit?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, you're right. There is it's like kind of related to this idea of observation changes the outcome. And what does that pain do? Does that kind of help you, cause you to take your foot off the gas because you're like, all right, I'm good? Or does it continue to bolster you? What a great question. And, Tyler, I had heard about you back when I was doing AI more with Techspert before I shuttered it. And I was like, "Look, these guys look like they're pretty cool, kind of some overlap there." And as I've stepped away from AI, I'm not as plugged in. And I read some articles that said deep learning AI is running into a roadblock. And I remember I was scratching my head at that one because I remember as I was shifting away from AI, I thought to myself, we're just scratching the surface with what AI can do. And I'm curious because you are smack dab at the heart of it, in the belly of the beast. Aside from potentially psychedelics, what do you think is the next sector or challenge for AI that is exciting for you?
Yeah, I think a lot of the analysis that's done today is retroactive. So, say we have this recording, after we upload it to a system, we transcribe it, we analyze, we pull out insights. And what I'm seeing as this next frontier is real time analysis and almost different layers of multimodal data collection. So I believe it's Neuroscape, but working on sort of like real time biofeedback monitoring to then modify the environment that you're in for optimal healing and optimal wellness. I think that part is really interesting. And there's so many passive challenges throughout that. But overall, it's a beautiful, at least theoretical application of this technology to improve not just, I would say, mental health, but maybe overall wellness. And I know you're an advocate of tying together experiences with music and then the positive consequences that that can have. I think from a challenge perspective, generally what we're seeing is a challenge with sort of this explainability of AI, which is how did you get this output, especially in healthcare? It's like if you rate someone's sentiment and they say, how did you get this sentiment? Like the question is, where does this original data set come from? And a lot of the data sets are trained off movie dialogue or social media sentiment, right? They're not modified, they're not built for these specific use cases. So I think the challenge is to get very vertical on the models and then not even tailor them just specifically for mental health, but actually for, say, psychedelic specific healing.
This concept of explainability and the whole black box. Oh man, AI is such a black box. How do we solve that? For me, I was never really as worried about that because the brain is a fucking black box. At the end of the day, that split brain experiment where some people that have the connection of their left brain and right brain cut off, and they did a bunch of interesting experiments, to see that we actually, as we explain things, it's one side of the brain that's just trying to come up with a rational explanation that doesn't make us look dumb, which is good. It's obviously evolutionarily a wise thing to do, but our brains are a black box. When a doctor makes a prescription or a diagnosis, there's still an element of black box. So I'm kind of bullish on, okay, sure, AI is a bit black boxish, but maybe that's just okay.
Yeah. Honestly, overall, I'm optimistic about it. I just think I'll give one simple example that I've seen was this application. Maybe you came across it, Replica, which people are using as sort of their own different versions of it, but basically a digital avatar that they're interacting with. And frankly, it's a lot of lonely people who are struggling building up this relationship with a digital avatar, and they're leveraging OpenAI's GPT-3 system. And what has happened is there has been some wonky outputs from that replica because of just you don't know how it arrives at that
Mm.
output that has actually had damaging mental health effects on the people who are then interacting with that system. And all of a sudden their replica that they've built for a year, 2 years, whatever, is saying insane crazy stuff or saying something personal. And like that's almost seems like a silly example, but when we start then trying to do patient outcomes or healthcare outcomes, I think there's just this element of risk. And again, I agree. I'm overall optimistic. And there's companies now open sourcing. Talked about it today. Meta just open sourced a large
Mm.
language model, at least for researchers. I think more and more that will be is like, how did it come to this output? Can I understand there? So at least if you're making an assessment or a decision, you know where you can use that as a data point or filter to then make your next course of.
This idea of one of the canonical training methods, as you know, with AI is dropout, where you have all these inputs and then you kind of block and you let it train and then you block a side of it and say, okay, relearn with minimal inputs now, find new paths, and it obviously uncovers a lot of interesting things. I have found that deep sessions with psychedelics feel the same way, where especially if you're doing it with eyes closed, minimal inputs, if you're not having to deal with someone or talk to someone and figure out what to say, what to do with my face, how do I look cool? Instead, you just go in and you cut off a lot of the inputs. A lot of my biggest revelations and ideas have come, and it has felt like, in a way, neural network dropout. And speaking of this conversation of AI and psychedelics, Tyler, you struggle with concussions during your hockey days, and I appreciate your candor on that. And you once told me that you tried journaling, you tried meditation, and while they were great, they weren't enough. And I'm curious, what has your evolution with head trauma been like? And what role did psychedelics play?
Yeah. So just I guess then to just for some context, I was a hockey player. I'd say competitive slash semi-competitive, and towards the tail end of my career, I had took two successive blows to the head in one game. And first one sort of it was what was really weird about that was that I continued to operate, already had a concussion, but your body is still operating as was. The brain doesn't understand. And then took another hit later in the game, and that was the one that sort of was lights
Mm.
out. And I literally at some certain occasions of that in the close trauma to it, I thought that I was just as an example dating a girlfriend from 2 years ago. Like I was in a different time era of my life from that hit, right? And so that was, I mean, that's a really scary experience. And I would say the outcomes that I've had from that were um, temper, like, and those are really sad things. You know what I mean? You just all of a sudden you can't control your
Mm.
temper, your impulse control is just completely destroyed. You just start to trend towards depression, anxiety. For me, it was recurring thought loops that started to emerge. And during that time, I ended my hockey career. Unfortunately, got into this sort of stage of partying in my life, and then I felt this sort of need to exit that, and then moved and trended towards psychedelics and had some very powerful mushroom experiences. I would say though, because of those qualities I just listed, I actually leaned towards abusing psychedelics. I saw them as this um, holy divine space that I could enter and forget about the pain and suffering that I was having, or the lack of purposelessness and purpose and meaning in my life.
Mm.
And so that the psychedelic experience, and we've talked about things like ego dissolution and things like that. It accelerated my eventual
Mm.
collapse, basically. So my eventual collapse ended up to me, which was a manic almost basically psychotic state that ended up with me institutionalized, partly spurred on by abuse of psychedelics use. And that's a sad reality that can happen, especially if you've experienced head trauma, if you have other conditions of childhood trauma, and just certain circumstances in your life. However, the insights that came from that were also very true and
Mm.
positive. And I think I could have actually delayed my suffering for a lot longer if I hadn't used psychedelics. And in the end, what it taught me was you need to wrap yourself around community. You need to take time to integrate the experiences that you have. And if used in the right way, it can be an incredibly healing, divine experience that for me has actually eliminated those temper tantrums, has eliminated that lack of impulse control, all these things that healed over time, but needed some pretty heavy lessons and blows along the way.
Wow, what a story. It sounds like maybe that was the thing you needed to go through. And perhaps it was a little bit of the Joseph Campbell hero's journey going into the void. And as you came out of it, you came back with the boon and with more skill sets. And maybe you had to go through that. I appreciate your focus on no, they need to be used respectfully, intentionally. They need to be integrated. These are not for play. They can be for play, and that's okay. I don't want to demonize recreational use. That's probably why I got into it, quite frankly, as a young adult, or at least got familiar with it. But the true work, the intentional work is exactly that. It's work. And it takes time and reflecting on the experience, unpacking it, making sense of it, taking time to journal and make and write down the takeaways and figure out what am I going to do differently now that I've got that insight. And you talked about community, and you are one of the community organizers in Canada for psychedelics. I'm curious for you, Tyler, what is one of the challenges for psychonaut activists in your country?
Yeah, so I'm sitting in just outside Toronto, Canada right now. I originally started the psychedelic community in London, Ontario, and the reason there was many reasons why I started that. Don't like to take it as I created it. It was more of a co-creation and channeling of a need that I
Hmm.
had. And part of it was accelerated by that piece that I just told you, which was when I went through my own experience, I had no community wrapped around me. And I think that's generally one of the biggest challenges that people have is that they're having these breakthroughs, sometimes at breakneck speed, and they don't have supportive people around them who understand and can empathize with that experience. When I was going through those things, I had people who had never had psychedelic experiences trying to give me advice and guidance and frankly, sometimes rejecting a lot of the experiences I had, and that was what actually helped not set, contributed to sending me down this
Hmm.
downward spiral. So I think in general, more from a holistic view, this is what people are looking for: community and connection, and people to empathize and share these experiences with. Uh, I'll add a couple last things that I've noticed from starting the community. I could not believe the breadth of people that came out. So we held out an amazing co-working space in Innovation Works 2019 when we started it, and I think 50 people showed up, and it was all the way from people who had never had a psychedelic experience to emergency surgeons at some of the most reputable hospitals in the world. And we were all coming together to learn to and connect with that community. And then lastly, because of that, what I saw was the need for dealing with the legal ramifications or even the fear of legal ramifications of that. If you're a head surgeon at a hospital, it's sort of scary for you to show up at these events, especially in a small community, right? And what we found as we moved into online events, a lot of people started to not show up to the events because they were scared of being on Zoom, recorded. There is a connection between people's own private lives and their experience with psychedelics that is very vulnerable, and not so many people are as open as you and I are about that. And so respecting that and dealing with that is a big part of building a successful community in psychedelics.
We run into the same issue with the psilocybin soiree, where it's this remote community. And it's funny you talked about this the breadth of different types of users. I've had a bunch of people on our inbound onboarding first calls say, I'm probably not the average user for you. And quite frankly, there is no average user. We see people in their 30s, 40s, 50s. We see people that are just starting their career. We see some that are very experienced, and like there really is no template. And it's nice to see the variety, quite frankly. And yet, you're right, coming out of the psychedelic closet ain't easy. And so, when people like you do that, I think it's powerful. And just to go back very briefly, Tyler, I liked how you talked about this idea of abusing it. And you look back on it now with perspective. And as you do, for someone that's starting out or early on, what are the signs of say, you know what, I'm not using this in a healthy way right now? Psychedelics can be powerful, but right now I'm not doing it right. What would you say as you look back with retrospective view?
Yeah, and I think it's a hard to people are so individual, right? And I think you touched on something really nicely, which is psychedelic. Like people have this desire when they hear something like that to say psychedelics isn't for fun or it's not for play. I don't believe that's true. I think they are the most enjoyable experiences you can have, especially once you learn a bit about yourself and you dose properly. with the right people, with the right environment, with the right music. Those are joyful, creative moments that everyone, I believe, deserves to have in their life. I find I'll just give you a couple signs from me when I went through, because every experience is personal. And I think if you look into I think looking into your family and understanding qualities of, are there genetic disorders that run in your family? Like, are there things like schizophrenia, bipolar, anxiety, depression? I think that not necessarily is a reason to just not proceed, but I think it's something that you should be aware of as you have those experiences. And that's something that has run through my family that I just didn't understand could be unlocked through excessive use of psychedelics. And I think that's the other way that I look at it, is this term excessive, and that means anything to anyone, like what excessive is. But I believe, as a aware person, as a spiritually connected person, when you are making
Mm.
that, when whether it's popping a mushroom or a tab in your mouth, and you feel like there's this moment where you said, do I need this right now? Is this really, necessary for me to have fun? Is this necessary for me to have joy? And generally the trend will be that you will push forward and do that anyways. And then some of those experiences might not be as magical or fruitful or positive as you hope. And obviously there's this conflict between sort of positive and negative experiences, and all being good for your growth and development. But I do think there is this well that you can tap if you do it too much too quickly, and then you don't have the people around you to rally your support. And then just a couple of physical symptoms or sort of mental experiences that I have were speed of speaking, which, as you can tell, I'm already a quick talker. So it basically sounded like a machine gun. I would say, so that was basically that sleep. Sleep
Mm.
is like, it's just conflicted. And if you can't fall asleep at night, especially if you're having psychedelics too late in the
Mm.
evening, and then you're destroying your own sleep patterns and you're staying up to 4 or 5 a.m. And then for me, I was still going to work, I was still going to
Mm.
school, things like that. Like, you're sitting on 4 hours of sleep. And if you continue that pattern, you will have a breakdown no matter what, at some point. And so those are, I mean, a couple things that I think that I just felt this sort of loop emerge, which was, as my voice was picking up, so was the loops in my brain moving at a speed, until there was this switch over where it almost wouldn't stop. And those become very negative things. And those are very hard to avoid. It's so crazy once you get caught in a thought loop, how hard it is to get out of
Yes.
that, depending on what that loop is, how it was induced, and your own personal awareness of how to work through those challenges.
Self-awareness. Seems like a lot of it does come back to that. I love this idea of looking at your sleep patterns and looking at your speech patterns. Do those seem healthy now? And the big doses, they are something that are incredibly powerful and transformative. And yet, and I don't think the headline is people are doing too much psychedelics. If anything, the world, we're not doing enough. And yet it is worth mentioning, to your point, like Terence McKenna, God bless him, an innovator, a philosopher king in a lot of ways. But this idea of like 10-gram trips, the hero dose where you need to do 10, 15, even 5 grams. For me, it's like I've had large dose experience or very impactful experiences on 2.5, 3. I don't, and it feels like oftentimes diminishing returns with 4, 5, 6 plus doses. I don't think you need that. And I think there is definitely a way to do too much. For me, anything more than once a month, and sometimes not even that, is too much. And it's like there's no scoreboard with this stuff. There's no flex. Oh, I did this much. That's not cool. That's not it. Finding that moderation with self-awareness, I think, is really important. And yet these big experiences can be completely transformative. Speaking of which, Tyler, would love to take a stab at the ineffable with you on one mystical experience. I'll share one, and I'll kick it to you. I had one recently, actually this past weekend, on 3.5 grams of mushrooms, where it felt like, Tyler, it was like this Tony Stark tune-up, where if you watch the evolution of those Iron Man movies, the suit and the man go from this clunky relationship to this like kind of a half man, half machine hybrid in a much more elegant way. And it felt like, for me, I had this sense on my umpteenth trip that my normal waking consciousness was kind of merging with my ability to perceive or feel or sense the infinite. And I'm still kind of unpacking it and integrating it. And I'm just very grateful for that experience. Tyler, what is one mystical experience that still resonates with you?
Thank you for sharing. Um, so I'll tell about one of, I guess, my early experience when going through that sort of time. Uh, Really, actually, through my first psychedelic experiences, and I had a moment where there's a spot in London, Ontario, where it's this big sort of chapel where all the sisters are, and it's these beautiful lawns with forest backing on it. And I was had, I believe, some mushrooms, and I'm not sure the exact dose, but probably 3.5 grams. And I went and just sat in the garden there, and it was maybe 12 a.m., 12 at night, and I just sat there. And the experience that I had was so at peace that basically a pack, and if you're in that area, a pack of deer actually surrounded me. Basically, like I was so at peace that the deer felt comfortable, basically coming like feet from me and just seeing that I was part of nature, part of the world, and at complete peace and calm. And I'll just never forget that experience in this moment of trying to just not disrupt or send out any anxiety through myself so that I would scare these deer away. And I just sat there for, I don't even know, like you said, this time is, sometimes you don't know what time is, and you just have that moment. So that was really cool. I just want to share one more, which was a recent, one quick part on yours, which is like the ebbs and flows of psychedelic use, I think are really important because, for an example, I went to Burning Man in 2019. I'm sure this comes up in your calls going again in 2022. Generally, it's almost like software. It's like a sprint. You're doing a sprint of psychedelics. You go into the void, you go into the wild, and you're going to do a lot more than you would do in a regular time in your life. You have this compressed hyper learning, hyper experience, and then after that, you take the break. So I think there are moments of ebbs and flows where it makes sense to decrease and decrease your intake, and you should always be sort of testing and experimenting. And so I had an amazing experience at Burning where I had felt myself as so, I would say, like lucid, or didn't just have this response, this understanding of who I was. And I had this moment finally at Burning Man where in 2019 where I realized that there is a core central part of myself that I love, and that is there, and that is a voice inside me. And that was a really beautiful moment. And one last piece here that I had this really interesting experience, which was I was listening to an amazing artist in Theo, obviously in Theo and Theo Nation. It's a husband and wife couple that listen to music, and they have very transcendent, made for psychedelic experience music. And they had these sort of little twinkles going through the music. And I had this experience on a high dose of LSD, basically chasing my own ego through a library. And all I could see was the shadow running through the library in between the books, and I could never see this version of myself. And finally, at this moment, a very brief glimpse, I saw my own ego, and I realized it was myself, but just a scared, vulnerable version of myself. And I think that's what I realized at that moment. My ego was it's just a scared baby that is ourselves, that's self-conscious, that's terrified of the world that is, of how people feel about them. And that was a very transformative moment for me. It still makes me
Mm,
emotional just thinking about it today.
mm. Bravo. Thank you for that, Tyler. That is a good transition from this fantastic deep dive to the speed round soul search. Tyler, question number one: who did you grow up idolizing?
Talked about it at the start. This one just sticks out. Steve Eiserman was a Red Wings captain, spent 20 years there, and just was an absolute leader. And to me, a person who I admire so much for the way that they brought the best out of people around.
Question number two: you are on a desert island for the next 10 years, Tyler. You only get to bring one mind altering substance with you. What are you bringing?
LSD.
Question number three: Tyler, we talked about this a little bit at the open. What is your favorite social media platform?
I like LinkedIn. I like that we all pretend to be professional on there.
uh, Tyler, last question, question number four: who is a current role model of yours?
I really, honestly, I really admire my partner right now. I learned a lot from her, and she has showed me just a different side of life of how you can operate when you're not just focused on business and money and all these things. And I've just learned so much from her approach to life, and I'm very thankful to have a partner that is a role model and mentor for me.
Oh, that's beautiful. Tyler, This was wonderful. Thank you for joining the show. I think you are one of the leaders in this space, and your ability to speak candidly, extemporaneously is an inspiration to a lot of us, and your story is important. Where can the viewers find you?
Oh, the very professional place of LinkedIn is one of my favorite places to be. I write occasionally on tylerbryden.com. I have a podcast, Speak with Tyler Bryden, which I again occasionally do, but I'm trying to build that practice up just like you are. And whether people listen or not, it's just we've spent the last few years just sometimes in our own heads, and just to have that experience, to have that connection and to work through communication is something I've really enjoyed. And I'm pretty open, so if you find me anywhere, send me a message. Tyler at speakai.co is also an easy email. I love email too, to be honest.
Good stuff. Okay, Tyler, thank you. We'll talk soon. Next week,
Thank you, Ray.
Pascal Tremblay, founder of Nectara, will be joining the show. Come join me and other high-dose solo explorers at the Psilocybin Soiree. Promo code is Mushroom22. Thank you for watching this episode of Psychedelic Diaries. I am Ray Christian. See you next time.